Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball. Welcome to episode 22 of Almost Cooperstown. And I think it's kind of interesting because this week we wanted to talk about something a little bit different because it wasn't something that we really thought was that prevalent, in the history of baseball until we started diving into it. And that's major league trades of Hall of Fame players and then almost Hall of Fame players. For the most part, we're going to be discussing mostly guys that are in the Hall of Fame or guys that just actually aren't even yet eligible to it. We're going to try and mostly stick to the bigger name trades here.
It started for me when thinking about some of the worst trades in Major League Baseball history, and sadly they involved the Mets too often, and Nolan Ryan, obviously being a Hall of Famer who was traded, but he never did win the World Series after he was traded. So we're going to start with the players that got traded, and then the team they went and won the World Series.
And I think that's what makes it unusual, because it's not too often there's a guy that's a Hall of Fame player that's traded and then goes on to help that next team win the World Series. Most of the time, if a guy's getting traded, it's not necessarily because of his skills at that point.
And guys got traded, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century. So guys got traded for various reasons different than today, including trying to bring fans in to watch the team. You might trade for a soon-to-be Hall of Fame player. You wouldn't even think about the Hall of Fame if you're talking about 1910. And you trade a guy because it brings fans into the park. There was no TV. There's no radio. The only way you made money was getting fans to come and watch the game and follow the team. So you would bring in an aging player, a good player, maybe even a great player who was on the back half of his career, simply with the idea of trying to get the fans interested in the team for some reason.
And I think it's interesting because the first one we're going to talk about, it's actually he helped win a World Series. We've talked about a fair bit actually on this show, and that's Tris Speaker, all the way back in 1916.
Right. And so the Red Sox won the World Series the first year in Fenway in 12. Mm-hmm. They won a game again in 15. They won in 16. And Tris Speaker was a part of those teams. And so he's a beloved Red Sox player. And then he has a big disagreement on money, which is a lot of times what happened with players. And he didn't feel that he was being treated fairly by the team. And so the Red Sox decide they're going to trade him for a pitcher named Sam Jones, who was a good pitcher on the Indians, and another one called Freddie Thomas. They go to the Red Sox, and Tris Speakers, and $55,000 do the Indians send to the Red Sox.
Yeah, which was the most that anybody had ever paid for at the time. And in terms of the disagreement, it's kind of interesting because Speaker was being paid $14,000 a year and wanted to cut him down to $9,000 a year.
Take a pay cut.
Take a pay cut of $5,000. To us, it doesn't seem like a lot. But one, think about the proportion of money he's being paid at the time. They're asking him to almost take over a 1/3 percentage cut on his salary. And he was in the prime of his career.
Absolutely. And Speaker, he had led the league in batting average, on base average. He was a great player and the best center fielder in the game. And so he gets traded to the Indians and ends up being the player manager of the Indians for that 1920 World Series team that we talk about all the time. And they ended up winning the World Series, and Tris Speaker had a lot of productive years with the Indians, and he won a World Series with his new team. So one of the reasons he is one of the greatest players of all time is because he won those World Series with the Red Sox, and then he went and became player manager and won with the Indians.
Now, the next one didn't actually happen that many years later. It was only 3 years later. But I mean, this one's kind of one everybody knows. So it's almost, you don't need to talk that much about it in some senses.
And it's really not even a trade.
Yeah, but when Ruth went from the Red Sox to the Yankees.
Right. And that launched the curse of the Bambino. Mm-hmm. And again, Babe Ruth won the World Series with those 1918 Red Sox.
He also won it with the 15 and 17 Red Sox.
So 15 and he wasn't on the 12th, the 15-16.
15,
right.
yeah.
15-16. So right. And the Red Sox, by the way, had won 5 World Series by the time 1918 ended, and then they didn't win another one until 2004. I'll have you know that they have won 4 World Series in the first 18 years of this century when they won in 2018. They could be done.
The curse of the Betts, the curse of the Betts Bino.
I don't know.
You trade away Mookie Betts, and now this is what you get.
Yeah, that's a good. I hadn't thought of that. So yeah, Babe Ruth, and for $125,000, right? So
back then's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And as the story goes, the owner of the Yankees was investing in Broadway shows, and one of the shows was No No Nanette, and he needed money for the show, and so the way he got the money was he sold Babe Ruth and got $125,000 and a mortgage on Fenway Park, and that was that. Babe Ruth becomes a Yankee, and they build Yankee Stadium, and there you go.
So we actually had to wait a while then before the next Hall of Famer to be traded would be traded and help that team he was traded to win a World Series. We actually had to wait all the way to 1951.
Yeah, and this is one of my favorite players growing up. Reading about him, right? He had his big World Series for the Milwaukee Braves in 1957 when he won 3 games. What I didn't know, is that he was a Yankee. Which is really kind of ironic because the Yankees, have Lou Burdette in the early 50s, and Johnny Sain gets traded for Lou Burdette, and they didn't think very much, the Yankees did, of Lou Burdette.
So they just basically thought they were giving up like a pretty good prospect or young player for like what was a pitcher, in the prime of his career, essentially, or near the end of his prime of his career.
But certainly not anybody that you needed to worry too much about, except that they did have to worry about him because in 1957, the Milwaukee Braves beat the Yankees, and Lou Burdette wins 3 games against the team that traded him, and the Braves won their only World Series in Milwaukee. In fact, the Braves went again to the World Series in 1958, but this time the Yankees prevailed, and Lou Burdette didn't quite have. But
so, yeah, series. I mean, to have the guy that you traded all those years back really come back and bite you there is unfortunate.
Yeah, I didn't know that about his history of having been a Yankee before, so I thought that was cool. A guy who just died recently, one of the, I think it's 5 Hall of Famers that have passed on recently this year. Lou Brock, this was a very famous trade when Lou Brock went from the Cubs to the Cardinals, and the Cubs, who were kind of snake bit even, is in 1964, making a deal that their fans probably still lament to this day. Ernie Broglio, who was probably the best player in that trade, and Bobby Shantz, who was a good pitcher. Another guy named Doug Clemens, no relation to the Rocket. For Brock, Jack Spring and Paul Toth, 2 guys I've never heard of.
So it's never good when you have one of these historical trades and you can only recognize one of the player names out of them. Generally, that means one of these teams lost real bad.
Ernie Broglio was a pretty good player. I guess I knew Bobby Shantz because he played for a bunch of teams and was a good major league pitcher, won over 100 games in his career. In any event, before the trade that year, the 8th place the Cardinals were, and then they win the National League pennant because the Phillies choked, if everybody remembers that from our episode about greatest collapses in history. The Cardinals not only do that, they go to the World Series and they beat the Yankees. So in the year he gets traded, they come from 8 games down, they win the pennant and the World Series.
Yeah, and Brock was a huge part of that. Let's see, so for the Cardinals, he hit 348 with 12 homers and 44 RBIs.
And I think for a long time, Lou Brock had the highest batting average in the history of the World Series because he had that one under his belt, and he didn't play into too many others, if I'm not mistaken. And he may still have one of the highest batting averages in the World Series in the history of the game.
And then, you actually don't have to wait that long before you get the next one. You only have 7 years to go. And this is one I didn't actually know about because I just always thought he was a Red his entire life. Well, and another gentleman that actually just recently passed away as well with Joe Morgan.
Exactly. And while we love Joe Morgan, we didn't pick him as our greatest Red of all time, but he actually started not as an Astro, believe it or not. He came up before the Astros were called the Astros. They were called the Colt 45s. And so he gets drafted, and the Astros, they hadn't built the Astrodome yet. So the Astrodome didn't come into 1964. I think this is 1963, and he was on the Colt 45s. Now he's on the Astros, and he got traded from the Astros to the Reds for some players that people would know. Jack Billingham was a fine pitcher. Ed Armbruster was a good player. Cesar Geronimo played on the World Series championship teams for the Reds, and Dennis Menke was a pretty good. And Lee May was a very good first baseman for the Astros. Tommy Helms, also had a hitting streak record in the National League. I think he had 41 games or something like that. So this was a big trade with good players.
But it's interesting, and I'm guessing at the time, Morgan wasn't one of the bigger names involved in this deal. Was he?
That's a good question. I don't think so either. I mean, I think they knew he was a talented guy, but he certainly hadn't shown anything that
he's always known as a Red, so it's hard for me to imagine he had any kind of significant career with the Astros or the 45s prior to becoming a Red.
Well, and again, this is until 1971 that this trade was made. So he is in Houston for a number of years. Before he gets traded to the Reds.
So he's a bit of a known quantity by the time he goes to the Reds.
Right, and certainly not a star, not expected to do what he did. Once he got to the Reds, his career kind of took off because the Reds were good as of 72 all the way through their World Series victory in 76.
Almost like right after he showed up or something.
Yeah, that would be kind of true.
So, I mean, interesting. We have another middle infielder up next. And this is one where it's kind of hard for me to believe that this guy, one, was dealt because I thought he was, again, a Cardinal his entire career. So I just had no idea that Ozzie Smith was traded.
Yeah, and interesting because Ozzie Smith at the time, and this is how I remember Ozzie Smith early in his career, great field, no hit. It wasn't like he was a kind of a decent
He was
hitter.
Ray Ordonez, except better.
He was a bad hitter, and the guy he was traded for, Gary Templeton, was the star to a degree. He had all-star appearances, although one year he wouldn't go to the all-star game. His famous words, Gary Templeton, was, "If I ain't starting, I ain't departing." And he didn't get a starting nod for the all-star game, and he didn't show up for the all-star game.
Wow.
Which that was a big thing, at that time. And yeah, Ozzie Smith had a no-trade clause, and he demanded a twice his salary to waive it. And so they basically swapped shortstops for the most part. There were other guys involved in a 6-player deal, but they're all secondary or tertiary players.
When you had two guys of this quality that were being swapped for each other, that's not uncommon.
And everybody knew that, Ozzie Smith was the best, a great defensive shortstop even at the time, but you didn't expect him to hit. And somehow he figured it out when he went to St. Louis as a hitter. And then little by little, he became an above average hitter. And I think that's really interesting that a guy who looked like he couldn't hit his way out of the proverbial paper bag ended up being not just if it would have been just an average hitter, it would have been fantastic with his defense. He was an above average hitter.
And it's not that Templeton went on to be a bad player for the Padres. It's just that he was an above average offensive shortstop for the time, but that was about it. It wasn't like Smith, who was a solid offensive player and one of the best, maybe the best defensive shortstop of all time.
I think that's an argument that I would probably support you on.
So it's more in terms of the value that Smith, like, this wasn't even necessarily a bad trade. It's just the value Smith ended up bringing was so insane compared to.
And Templeton played 10 years in San Diego. As my dad would have said, he's no stiff.
They didn't get ripped off here.
Exactly. So another Cardinal who got traded, and this was only, right after that, 1983. I'm sorry, so it was a little bit later than that. Keith Hernandez. 2 years later, Keith Hernandez. So you got to think about Hernandez. He's on the Cardinals, and he wins the World Series in 1982. Mm-hmm. He had shared the MVP with Stargell in 1979. So a great player, I'd say. They knew how good a fielder he was. And Keith had some issues off the field.
I think all of the 86 Mets did.
Yeah. Well, this is before. So one of the things was when Keith...
Right. Yeah, it's before. But we have to look at the collection of guys they start amassing, because the next guy on our list is somebody else we might had some troubles as well.
Well, but Keith gets traded, to the Mets. And if we remember, the guy that he got traded for was Neil Allen, who was the Met closer at the time. But I think his 11 saves in his career were all with the Mets, and he was just a relief pitcher with the Cardinals, and they thought they were getting a good relief pitcher, and when they got was an average one at best. Rick Ownby, for people, was the other pitcher in that trade, and Hernandez changed the Mets, right? And
it is a kind of a really weird trade when you look at this one, because it wasn't like Hernandez was old at this point. He was a couple of years off of winning an MVP.
No, he just had a falling out with management. I think they knew he was doing some things that he shouldn't be doing off the field, and doing some cocaine and
they
things.
Just didn't want to deal with it.
Whitey didn't want to have him on the team, and Strawberry came up with the Mets in '83. So the Mets, who were really bad, were not quite as bad once Strawberry got there. And then halfway through the season, or June 15th, '83, they trade for Hernandez. All of a sudden, they look around and go, hey, we got some guys that aren't so bad.
Yeah, so what do they do the next offseason, basically?
Right. They bring in the guy from Montreal who was the best catcher in the game at the time.
One of the, a Hall of Fame catcher. They go out and get Gary Carter from the Expos.
And the Mets trade a good player in Huey Brooks, good young player, an average catcher in Mike Fitzgerald, and 2 minor leaguers for Gary Carter. I still don't understand why the Expos
and you know the minor leaguers are bad because we're talking about a deal that's whoever knows how many eons old at this point, and all they're known as is 2 minor league players. It's not a good sign.
You don't even name them.
Yeah, it's like still being a player to be named later, like 15 years after the deal is made.
So Ozzie Smith obviously wins we talked about him. He wins World Series with the Cardinals. Keith Hernandez and Gary Carter come over to the Mets, and they win World Series with their new teams, just to be consistent here.
Yeah. So every one of the guys we've talked about has been traded to a new team and then won the World Series with the new team.
We think that's kind of special.
And I think that's kind of special. And now we get to the last guy that has done so.
That's right. And in fact, he's busy right now. He'll be doing the final game of the National League Championship Series in the booth. John Smoltz.
Now, I thought I always. Now, this is because he was traded in '87, which was conveniently 2 years before I was born.
Like Lou Burdett for me.
So to me, unfortunately, he's always was with Brave, and that's what I knew him as until I think he became the Red Sox closer near the end of his career.
You're right. I think you're right.
And here, I mean, I don't think you need to say much about Smoltz because to me, he's just so unique in pitching. He was a dominant starter for a bunch of years and then became a dominant closer.
Yeah, there's only one other player that I think you could put into that category. I don't know if you would have called him a dominant starter, but he had won well over 100 games, and that's Eckersley. So Eckersley did both. And
I don't know if
also in the Hall of Fame.
I don't know. I need to look up Smoltz, actually. Give me a second here because I'm just curious because I would love to look at, did he win any Cy Youngs in his career and when did he win them?
Yes, he did win Cy Youngs.
He did win a Cy Young. He won a Cy Young in '96 for
the World Championship. The National League Championship.
Braves.
The Yankees won the World Series that year.
And then he didn't become a closer. He only actually, you know what? It's a little presumptuous of me to proclaim him an elite closer because he really only closed for 3 seasons. Now, he was great in those seasons.
But he doesn't have like 300 career saves or anything like that.
No, he's got 150 career saves.
That's still pretty impressive.
Yeah, he saved 55, 45, and 44 games.
150 games in 3 years.
He almost won the Cy Young that first
as
year
a closer.
He became a closer.
Right,
yeah, he was third in the voting. So the fact that he could get that high as a closer says a lot about how good he was.
And I'm going to say we're probably leaving Eckersley off the list here because I know he pitched for the Red Sox and then got traded to the Oakland A's and obviously won the World Series with the Oakland A's in the late 80s. He was on that 89 Oakland A team, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, so we missed him.
So, yeah, because he pitched for Oakland when he gave up the home run to Gibson. And that was in the World Series in 1988, and then they won the World Series in '89. But he pitched for the Red Sox before that. So whether I can't remember if Eckersley was traded, I think he was, or it was a free agent deal. But he certainly was a guy who won the World Series with his second team.
And it's interesting because there's still a lot of noticeable Hall of Famers that were then traded, but didn't just end up making the impact to win the World Series. But they were so notable that they were traded.
Right? They didn't win. They didn't take their team. That's how we kind of broke it down. And in fact, I really thought when I started this that they just didn't trade guys back in the day, if you will. The big stars didn't get traded. We talked about Babe Ruth and Tris Speaker. That's pretty unusual. But as it turns out, Rogers Hornsby in 1926 got traded from the Cardinals to the New York Giants. And it was a giant trade for the time. And yet he didn't win the World Series with his new team.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you had a lot of there's a whole bunch of then trades with say the Mets, right? In the 70s where they traded Nolan Ryan and Tom Seaver, but Nolan Ryan, while he went on to, achieve a Hall of Fame career, Mets didn't miss any World Series that Nolan Ryan went on to win. And by the time they traded Seaver, Seaver was still a good pitcher, but he wasn't as much Tom Seaver.
He had some good years with the Reds. That's
but not as he was not the same
the dominant pitcher. Yeah, and I think that's sort of a consistency. Is like we said before, most of the guys that got traded sort of in the latter part of their careers when they weren't going to make a giant impact. Now we're talking starting with the Hornsby trade. He got traded for Frankie Frisch, who was a star second baseman for the Giants, and actually that was a trade that worked out. Frisch became a very good player and a Hall of Fame player. when he went in that trade and hit 361. So, for the Giants in 1927. So, he did his job going over there. And so that was a big trade because you had two primary players, even though Hornsby is one of the greatest of all time, and you may not put Frisch there, but he's a Hall of Famer, they got traded for each other.
Yeah, and then there are some trades where it's just like, I don't know what the team was thinking when they made this deal, because you have like the Frank Robinson deal in 65.
Yeah, right.
Where, like, they trade him for peanuts, literally. Pappas, Mike Pappas.
Milt Pappas.
Milt Pappas. Oh, sorry.
Milt Pappas.
Who won 30 games before they dealt him, and then a couple of guys named Joe, while Frank Robinson went on to win the MVP for the Reds the next season.
Right, so Robinson, as we talked about in an earlier podcast, that he won the MVP in the American League, and he's the only player to win it in both leagues. So he gets traded, which is a shocking trade from the Orioles to the Reds after the 65 season in December, and he wins the MVP the next year. I mean, talk
Just
about
a baffling trade.
How does that even happen? So, right, you mentioned Nolan Ryan, another great pitcher, Steve Carlton. When Carlton got traded from the Cardinals to the Phillies, he was traded for a guy named Rick Wise, who was a good major league pitcher, but not a great one, whose main distinction is that he pitched a no-hitter one time and hit 2 home runs in the no-hitter, did Rick Wise.
Yeah, Steve Carlton went to the Hall of Fame.
Right, lefty. As Tim McCarver would say, he plays an elevated game of pitch and catch. But Carlton, unfortunately, aside from that crazy season when the Phillies won something like 59 games and Carlton won 27 games out of their 59.
Yeah, that probably shows he was pretty good.
So, and you can go down the list, and it's hard to take a guy like Ferguson Jenkins and not think that he is one of the great pitchers of all time, and just doesn't really get the credit because he pitched in Chicago and they never won a World Series. That was where he had his greatest years. And then, he gets traded to the Texas Rangers in 73, and now Texas had only been there a couple of years. So it's sort of talk about being sent out to pasture. And he won a lot of games for Texas.
And I think that's what happens sometimes with some of these older players is I think with the greats, sometimes they're an unusual player because they keep being productive so much longer into their career. And I'm sure this is something obviously I can't verify, but I imagine in the past it was probably a lot more likely that you figured a guy that was 35 plus was just going to break down, because that's what they did. And so when you traded some of these older players that were getting into the twilights of their career, they weren't expecting them to go on and have another really good 3 or 4 seasons, and these guys just kind of ended up doing it.
And he got traded for a player I liked a lot, who was another almost guy in Bill Madlock, who won multiple batting titles. I think he won 2 batting titles in his 3 seasons in that trade back to Chicago.
It's then most of these teams, like there's been very few deals where the team got ripped off.
Mad Dog was a good player, but again, we just still an almost guy. But that was a big trade at the time.
Mm-hmm. And then, there were a couple big trades, like I think it's interesting is because then in the 90s, in the modern era now, and not so much the modern era, but more the recent era of baseball, you've had a lot of big name guys get dealt, but that Rick A's to the Yankees with Ricky Henderson was just weird.
Yeah.
There was just that was just they traded him to the Yankees, and then he left the Yankees and went back to the A's almost immediately.
Yeah, and he had a great season. He stole 52 bases and did his usual, on base percentage. What a great player this guy was. A 425 on base percentage. That's eye opening. And Ricky didn't lead the Yankees to the World Series because it took another 7 years until the Yankees began that string in 1996.
And then the next year, I have a tough time killing a team for doing this because you can't expect them to know when they're doing it like that. So the Red Sox in 1990 trade Jeff Bagwell to the Astros for the 36-year-old relief pitcher Larry Anderson.
That was a big trade. Larry Anderson was a piece to the puzzle that year.
Exactly. And he helped Boston won the AL East that season. So it's you can't really kill a team because then the prospect went on to be Jeff Bagwell.
And I imagine if you looked at Bagwell at that time with that funky batting stance, for scouts, it might have been a really hard thing to think this guy's going to be a great player.
Exactly. Yeah. The same way that and then you have a couple years later, in 98, Randy Johnson's traded from the Mariners.
At the trading deadline.
Which this made sense for the Mariners. They were starting to see their window close. They were going to need to re-sign a bunch of people because I think the A-Rod deal was coming up around this time, actually. So it made sense that they needed to trade. And Johnson, while he was dominant for the Mariners, there was still a lot of inconsistency. And what he put together after, not even when he went to the Astros, but when he finally ended up on the Diamondbacks, that was the key difference.
He started 11 games and sat down 116 hitters by strikeout in 84 innings. The Astros, didn't win in the NLDS, and that was the end of Randy Johnson and the Astros.
Yes, he was a rental. And you have a lot of guys, and you start seeing that. That's what you start seeing here, is because of the way the contracts and the way teams look at them have changed. You start seeing guys being acquired purely as a rental.
Right.
For instance, just to bring him up, this was a rental that happened in 2008 with CeCe when he went to the Brewers from the Indians. Everybody knew there was no chance he was re-signing with the Brewers after that season. It was just not going to happen. But they rented him out so that they could try and win the NLDS, which they ended up losing to the Phillies.
But I thought that was a bold move, and it didn't work out for CeCe. And then he ended up going to the Yankees and pitched 9 years for them. And here's a guy who didn't win the World Series, but he will be a Hall of Fame pitcher.
And he made it worth for the Brewers. I mean, he went 11-2.
Right, and that franchise really at that point hadn't had anything to cheer about for a really long time. So just showing your fans that you're all in by going and getting a player like CeCe Sabathia was a bold move, man, and good job by the Brewers management.
Mm-hmm. And I think the last one that's kind of a guy that ended up. He's not still active or ineligible for the Hall of Fame, I should say, because he is in the Hall of Fame, is the Roy Halladay deal.
Yeah, and we were talking about this before the show. So Halladay goes from the Blue Jays to the Phillies. So the Phillies win the World Series in 2008. That's gets that monkey off their back because they haven't won in a long time. So I think since 1980. And Roy Halladay gets traded there the next year. So after the 2008 season, he goes over to the Phillies, and the Phillies go again to the World Series in 2009, and they lose to the Yankees.
Now, future Mets prospect and heartbreaker was also involved in this deal because, unfortunately, this is where the Blue Jays got future piece Travis d'Arnaud.
Oh, wow. That's right.
So they get d'Arnaud in this deal, and then I think about 3 years later, they deal d'Arnaud and Syndergaard for one R.A. Dickey, fresh off of his Cy Young season.
That was probably one of the best Met trades ever, by the way.
Yeah, you can't really do much better than that. And then I think it's kind of interesting because there are a suite of guys that have recently been traded, and they are just either not in the Hall of Fame or they're just ineligible because it's been too recent to them retiring. And so I think there's a couple guys that are at least worth mentioning here, some of these deals, because you have some big names in here.
Like, and if they didn't win the World Series, but they contributed to their new team, certainly. I mean,
you'd argue McGuire is almost more remembered as a Cardinal than an A in some respects.
Oh, yeah, except he won a World Series with the A's. So
but he set the home run record with the
Rookie
Cardinals.
of the Year with the A's, World Series. Only one World Series. I was really surprised to think that those A's teams of the late 80s, they won in 1989. They lost in 88, Eckersley we talked about, to the Dodgers, and they lost in 1990 to the Reds. So they were in the World Series three years in a row, only won one of them.
But they won one.
And so, yes, McGuire going to the Cards was a big deal. Curt Schilling, and what a weird career he had before, he got to the Phillies even because he was an Oriole, I think, early in his career.
Then, yeah, he was an Oriole for a year or two, maybe 3, but then he went to the Phillies and kind of figured out and became...
He was a relief pitcher with control problems.
And then he figured out and became, at least a solid starter for them. But then he went to the Diamondbacks, and that's when he figured it out.
Yeah, everything. So he did win a World Series with the Diamondbacks
before he went on to win one with the Red Sox.
Correct. So I guess he would be in that category, but he is not in the Hall of Fame, and it doesn't seem like the voters are out there thinking that he is a shoo-in. But as we've said many times, this is a guy who is, despite everything you say about him, should be in the Hall of Fame just on the basis of his production and his career.
And then there were still some other ones. Obviously, everybody remembers that 2004 postseason where Beltran gets traded from the Royals to the Astros and just goes absolutely insane.
Yeah. And the Astros didn't win the World Series, but at least they got to the World Series.
Yeah, mostly on his back.
And Carlos Beltran.
But they didn't get to the World Series. They lost to the Cardinals.
Right. They went the next year. They went the next year and lost to the White Sox in 2005.
Right.
And so Beltran ended up parlaying that into the big contract with the Mets. And
he was worth the money.
Yeah. He did a lot of good things for the Mets, and he will be a Hall of Famer one day.
Definitely.
But again, didn't win a World Series with his new team. We talked about CC. And here's a guy who I guess could have been really useful this year, the Astros would tell you, because losing him, you could argue, was a reason.
They would have liked to have Justin Verlander on the mound last night.
Yeah, and when the Tigers traded Verlander to the Astros, it seemed a little bit at the time like Verlander was like not quite what he was.
Ironically, it almost seemed like one of those old-timey deals where you trade the aging, Hall of Fame candidate type player and late in his career. And he just kind of was, I'm not that late in my career, boys.
Right. And Verlander, again, in a Hall of Fame career for sure. I think he's a, no doubter. And we don't put guys like Zach Greinke in there because you keep calling him a mercenary. And I think that's true because he's pitched for so many teams. And I don't know that he's had that distinction of ever winning the World Series with one of those teams he's been traded on.
I'd have to look back through it. To me, it's like with the difference, what makes Greinke mercenary is more specifically the way in which he approached it. Certain guys end up pitching for lots of teams. Verlander's pitched for a bunch of different teams, I think, actually. But that's because he's gotten traded a bunch. Greinke as much sought out specifically short-term deals with a lot of these franchises after he got out of the Royals and has just pitched for whoever will pay him the money.
Yeah, and so we started by saying some of the
granted worth every penny of it. Don't get me wrong.
You just don't trade guys because of disagreements with the team too much anymore. It doesn't happen in baseball unless you can get equal value back. But Hall of Fame players like Al Simmons and Hack Wilson, who was still has the single season RBI record of 191, but had a drinking problem, as did Chuck Klein, and so they got traded for other reasons that were not necessarily related to their production on the field.
I think also because part of the reason also now is teams are so much better at being able to evaluate how much a player is actually contributing, that if you're an aging superstar, even if you're not necessarily totally declined yet, or you're, I guess I should say, even if you are on the decline, you would have to be so toxic in the clubhouse to get yourself kicked out, because teams know they're not going to get the because even if, let's say you're like a 4.5 WAR player that's on the downside of his career.
Per season, 4 or 5.
Per season, right? So you're a very good player, but you're obviously next year you might be 4, then 3.7, then 3.5. Like, it's going down, obviously. The problem is you're never going to get a player that's even remotely close to that back. At best, you're going to get prospects that are a couple years out from maybe contributing on that level. So I think teams are a lot more reluctant to trade players like that now because it's so much tougher to get the expected value back out of them.
Well, and you have to keep in mind that we had no free agency. So if you go back into the only way to move a player, and a lot of times I went through all these trades, that players were traded for cash. So teams were hard up for money, and they'd trade for a big player. And just
that will not happen
now.
You're never going to have a team go, you know what, we need a couple $100,000. Let's sell one of our best players.
That is just something that does not happen. Now, free agency has changed the game. We had a guy who started for the Rays, Charlie Morton, who after he left the Astros in 2017 was on the World Series winning Astros, didn't get traded, signed a free agent contract. I think he got $30 million from the Rays for 2 years, and the Astros waved bye-bye to him because they thought, and he went out last in the last game of the American League Championship and shut down the Astros, and the Tampa Bay Rays go to the World Series. There's a little poetic justice for Charlie Morton, I think, there, who is not going to be going to Cooperstown, by the way.
And we are all very glad, at least many baseball fans are, that there will be no Astros in the World Series.
Yeah, I would say there's some people that might say, wouldn't the Dodgers like another shot in, but they're going to have their difficulties getting through the Braves in Game 7.
I'm just going to enjoy how it ended up.
So I'm sure there'll be some other big-time trades along the way, in years hence. But for the time being, these are the biggest trades I think that we really have to talk about. There were other ones we didn't talk about, but these are the most significant ones.
Agreed. Thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform.
And you can follow us on Twitter at AlmostCoop.